Welcome to an incredible story that will take you on an emotional journey along the rugged Maine coast. You're about to discover the tale of a veteran and his loyal dog who uncovered a mystery that had been locked away for decades in an old lighthouse. This is a story of redemption, loyalty, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. Before we begin this amazing journey together, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another captivating story like this one. Now, let's dive into the mystery of Pemaquid Light. The Atlantic wind carried the taste of salt through the broken window of Thomas Mitchell's pickup truck as he drove along the winding coastal road toward Pemaquid Point. His German Shepherd Rex sat alert in the passenger seat, ears perked at every new sound and smell that drifted through the Maine morning air. Thomas had driven this route only once before, 20 years ago as a young man, but the memory felt like yesterday. Now, at 52, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines earned from both laughter and loss etched into his weathered face, he was returning not as a visitor, but as the new keeper of Pemaquid Light. The lighthouse position had been posted for months before Thomas saw it. Most people wanted nothing to do with living in isolation, maintaining an automated lighthouse that no longer needed a human keeper in the traditional sense. But for Thomas, recently retired from 30 years of military service, the solitude promised something he desperately needed: peace. The nightmares from his final deployment in Afghanistan still visited him most nights, and the city sounds of car horns and sirens only made them worse. Rex understood. The dog had been there too, had seen the same horrors, had saved Thomas's life when an IED took his left leg below the knee. "Almost there, buddy," Thomas said, reaching over to scratch behind Rex's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the seat, a steady rhythm that had become Thomas's favorite sound in the world. Rex had been trained to detect explosives, but these days his most important job was detecting the subtle changes in Thomas's mood that preceded the panic attacks, the flashbacks that could strike without warning. The lighthouse came into view as they rounded the final bend, and Thomas felt his breath catch. Pemaquid Light stood proud against the grey October sky, its white tower stark against the dark rocks that tumbled down to meet the churning sea. The keeper's house, attached to the tower, looked exactly as it had in the photographs: red brick with white trim, windows that faced the endless Atlantic, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. Harold Brennan, the lighthouse board president, was waiting by the front door, a ring of keys jangling in his weathered hand. He was a tall man, thin as driftwood, with eyes the same grey as the ocean behind him. "Tom Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Pemaquid. Though I should warn you, she's got her quirks." "Every old building does," Thomas replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "This is Rex. Hope that's still all right." Harold bent down, letting Rex sniff his hand before giving the dog a gentle pat. "Course it is. Lighthouse needs a good dog. Always has. My grandfather kept this light, you know, back when it still burned oil. He had a retriever named Sailor. Said the dog knew when storms were coming 3 days out, better than any barometer." They walked through the keeper's house, Harold pointing out the various systems Thomas would need to maintain. The automated light still needed regular checks, the fog signal required testing, and there were weather readings to record and transmit to the Coast Guard. The house itself was furnished simply: a kitchen with a wood stove, a living room with windows that looked out to sea, 2 bedrooms upstairs, and a small study lined with empty bookshelves. "The last keeper left some things in the basement," Harold said, pausing at a door near the kitchen. "Been down there 40 years or more. You're welcome to it, whatever it is. Haven't been down myself, bad knees, but my grandfather used to store all sorts of things down there. Maritime charts, old logs, that sort of thing." After Harold left, Thomas stood in the kitchen, listening to the house settle around him. Rex padded through the rooms, sniffing corners and doorways, mapping this new territory. Outside, the October wind was picking up, and Thomas could hear the distant bell buoy rocking in the swells. He unpacked slowly, setting his few possessions in place. A photo of his unit on the mantel, his father's compass on the kitchen windowsill, his medications lined up in the bathroom cabinet like soldiers at attention. That first night, Thomas climbed the spiral stairs to the lightroom just as sunset painted the horizon in shades of amber and rose. The Fresnel lens, fourth order and beautiful in its precision, began its automated rotation as darkness fell. Thomas stood there, Rex beside him, watching the beam sweep across the water, reaching out into the darkness, warning ships of the dangers that lurked beneath the waves. "We made it, boy," he whispered, his hand finding Rex's head. "We actually made it." The dog whined softly, pressing against Thomas's good leg, and together they watched the stars emerge, one by one, over the Atlantic. Thomas thought about all the keepers who had stood in this same spot, all the storms they had weathered, all the ships they had guided safely past the rocks. He thought about purpose, about finding meaning in the after, when the war was over, but the battles inside continued to rage. The first weeks passed in a rhythm of routine that Thomas found comforting. He woke at dawn, made coffee in the old percolator, and walked Rex along the rocky shore. He checked the light mechanism, recorded weather observations, and responded to the occasional tourist who wandered up despite the private property signs. In the afternoons, he worked on small repairs around the property, fixing shutters that banged in the wind, patching leaks in the keeper's house roof, painting the trim that had begun to peel from the salt air. Rex adapted quickly, establishing his own routines. He had favorite spots for watching the sea, favorite rocks for sunning himself, and he'd developed an inexplicable fascination with the basement door. Every morning after breakfast, the dog would sit by that door and whine, pawing at the wood, his nose working furiously at the gap beneath it. "What's down there, boy?" Thomas asked one morning, 3 weeks into their residence. "Harold said just old storage." "You smell mice? That what it is?" But Rex's behavior suggested something more than rodents. This was his working stance, the same focused intensity he'd shown in Afghanistan when he'd detected hidden caches, when he'd saved lives with his trained nose and unshakable instinct. Thomas had been avoiding the basement truthfully. Dark, enclosed spaces still triggered something primal in him, a remembered terror of mortar fire in narrow alleys, of searching caves where death could hide in any shadow. But Rex's persistence wore at him, and on a grey Thursday morning when the fog was so thick he couldn't see the ocean from the kitchen window, Thomas finally retrieved the key Harold had left him. The basement door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. The smell hit him immediately. Must and mildew, old paper and something else, something chemical and sharp. Rex pushed past him, eager, his tail rigid with excitement. Thomas found the light switch, an old push-button affair that clicked loudly in the silence. A single bulb illuminated wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness below. "Easy, Rex," Thomas commanded, and the dog froze, training overriding eagerness. Thomas descended slowly, testing each step, his prosthetic leg making the descent awkward. The basement was larger than he'd expected, with a low ceiling that forced him to duck his head. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes and crates, everything covered in decades of dust. But Rex ignored all of this, making straight for the far corner where a large shipping trunk sat against the stone foundation. The trunk was military. Thomas recognized the style immediately. World War II era, with reinforced corners and heavy clasps that had rusted but not failed. Rex sat beside it, looking at Thomas expectantly. The same look he'd given when he'd found IEDs, when he'd done his job and was waiting for his handler to take over. Thomas knelt beside the trunk, running his hands over the surface. There was a name stenciled on the side, faded but still readable. E. Brennan. Harold's grandfather, perhaps. The clasps were stiff but not locked, and with some effort Thomas managed to open them. The lid lifted with a protest of old hinges, and Thomas aimed his flashlight inside. The trunk was full of papers, photographs, and what looked like navigational equipment. On top was a leather journal, its cover water-stained but intact. Thomas picked it up carefully, opening to the first page. The writing was cramped but clear, dated 1943. Property of Ensign Edward Brennan, United States Navy, Pemaquid Light Station. If found, please return to... But the address that followed had been deliberately obscured, scratched out with such force that the pen had torn through the paper. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp basement. He turned the page and began to read. May 15th, 1943. Took up position at Pemaquid Light today. Official orders are to maintain the lighthouse and report any suspicious maritime activity to Naval Command. Unofficial orders, delivered in person by Commander Harrison, are of a different nature entirely. I am to watch for specific signals, sequences that indicate German U-boat activity off our coast. I am not to record these observations in any official log. I am not to discuss them with anyone, including other military personnel. I am to report directly to Harrison using the emergency frequency only. Thomas sat back on his heels, mind racing. German U-boats off the Maine coast during World War II. He'd heard vague stories, of course. Everyone who lived near the Atlantic had heard something, but this suggested something more organized, more secretive. Rex whined, pawing at another box beside the trunk. Thomas opened it to find more journals, maps with markings he didn't understand, and photographs of ships, some clearly American, others less identifiable. There were coded messages, or what looked like codes, series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to Thomas, but had clearly meant everything to Edward Brennan. One photograph stopped him cold. It showed a younger version of the lighthouse, and standing beside it, a group of men in naval uniforms. One face was circled in faded red ink, and beneath it someone had written a single word: traitor. Thomas spent the rest of that day in the basement, Rex patient beside him as he carefully went through the contents of the trunk. The story that emerged from Edward Brennan's journals was troubling. Brennan had been positioned at Pemaquid Light as part of a secret network monitoring German U-boat activity along the eastern seaboard. But he'd discovered something else, something that his superiors either didn't believe or didn't want to acknowledge. Someone was signaling the U-boats. Someone on the American side was providing them with information about convoy routes and patrol schedules. The entries became increasingly frantic as 1943 turned to 1944. Brennan was convinced he'd identified the traitor, someone high up in the local command structure, but every time he tried to report it, his concerns were dismissed. He began keeping his own records, gathering evidence, documenting patterns that he hoped would eventually prove his case. Then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The last one, dated December 15th, 1944, was different from the others, written in a shaky hand. They know, I know. Harrison came by yesterday, friendly as could be, but I saw it in his eyes. I've hidden the evidence where only someone like me would think to look. If something happens to me, if they say it was an accident, know that it wasn't. The light still shines, but shadows move within it. The truth is in the lens. Thomas climbed back up the stairs, his mind churning. Rex followed, clearly pleased with their discovery, but sensing his handler's agitation. In the kitchen, Thomas made coffee with shaking hands. What had he stumbled into? Was this why the lighthouse keeper position had remained empty for so long? Did Harold know about any of this? That night, unable to sleep, Thomas climbed to the light room. The beam swept steadily across the water, the mechanism humming its mechanical song. He examined the Fresnel lens, looking for any sign of what Brennan might have meant. The lens was a work of art, hundreds of prisms arranged in a precise pattern to focus and amplify the light. But there was nothing obviously hidden, no secret compartment or concealed message. It was Rex who found it, of course. The dog had followed Thomas up to the light room and was sniffing around the base of the lens apparatus. He pawed at a section of the floor, whining. Thomas knelt down, feeling along the floorboards, until he found it. a small irregularity, a board that was slightly higher than the others. He worked his knife into the gap and pried it up. Beneath was a small space, and in that space was an oilskin packet. Thomas's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were photographs, documents, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. The letter, in Brennan's now familiar handwriting, laid out everything. Commander Harrison had been taking bribes from German sympathizers, providing information that allowed U-boats to avoid patrols and target specific merchant vessels. Brennan had gathered proof, photographs of Harrison meeting with known German operatives, copies of coded messages, records of payments deposited in offshore accounts. But before he could act on it, Brennan had died in what was officially recorded as a fall from the lighthouse during routine maintenance. Thomas sat in the lightroom until dawn, reading and rereading the documents. The war had been over for nearly 80 years. Everyone involved was long dead, but the truth still mattered, didn't it? Brennan had died trying to expose a traitor, had hidden evidence in the hope that someday someone would find it and set the record straight. As the sun rose over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas made his decision. He would contact the Naval Historical Center, turn over everything he'd found. Brennan deserved that much, deserved to have his story told, his sacrifice acknowledged. But first he needed to know more. If Harold's grandfather had been Edward Brennan, did Harold know anything about this? The resemblance in the photographs was unmistakable. Thomas decided to approach it carefully, feeling out what Harold might know without revealing everything at once. That afternoon, Harold stopped by to check on how Thomas was settling in. They sat on the porch, looking out at the ocean, Rex lying between them. "Harold," Thomas began carefully, "you mentioned your grandfather kept this light. Edward Brennan, right?" Harold's face changed, a shadow passing over it. "That's right, though I never knew him. Died before I was born. Accident, they said. Must have been hard on your grandmother." "It was. She never really got over it. Always insisted there was more to the story, but nobody listened to an old woman's conspiracy theories." Harold was quiet for a moment, then added, "She kept saying he was murdered, that he'd found out something he shouldn't have, but there was never any proof." Thomas made his decision. "Harold, I need to show you something. If you're captivated by this mystery and want to know what happens next, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you'll know the moment we reveal more incredible true stories like this one. The truth that Thomas uncovered is just the beginning." They spent the next 3 hours in the basement, Harold reading his grandfather's journals with tears streaming down his weathered face. When he looked up at Thomas, his eyes were bright with a mixture of grief and gratitude. "All my life," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion, "all my life I've wondered. My grandmother went to her grave insisting he was murdered, but everyone thought she was just a grieving widow who couldn't accept reality. She was right. She was right all along." Thomas showed him the evidence hidden in the lightroom, the photographs and documents that proved Edward Brennan had died trying to expose a traitor. Harold held the letter his grandfather had written, hands shaking. "We have to do something with this," Harold said. "People need to know." "I was thinking the Naval Historical Center," Thomas suggested. "They have historians who specialize in World War II intelligence operations. This could rewrite a piece of history." Harold nodded, then paused. "But what if they try to bury it again? What if there are still people who don't want this story told?" It was a valid concern. Thomas had seen enough classified information in his military career to know that some secrets were guarded long after they ceased to matter for national security. But this was different. Everyone involved was dead, and the war had been over for nearly 8 decades. "We make copies first," Thomas said. "Document everything. Then we reach out to historians, journalists, anyone who might be interested. We make it impossible to ignore." Undine, over the next weeks, Thomas and Harold worked together to catalogue and preserve Edward Brennan's evidence. Thomas used his military contacts to connect with historians at the Naval War College, while Harold reached out to local historical societies and maritime museums. Rex seemed to understand the importance of their work, staying close, offering his quiet presence when the emotional weight of the discovery became too heavy. The response from the Naval Historical Center was immediate and intense. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in World War II coastal defense, drove up from Newport personally to examine the materials. She spent 3 days at the Lighthouse, photographing every document, recording Harold's family stories, and taking detailed notes about the hiding places where the evidence had been concealed. "This is extraordinary," she told them on her last evening, as they sat in the keeper's house kitchen. "We've long suspected there were intelligence failures during the U-boat campaigns of 1942 and 43, but this is the first concrete evidence of deliberate sabotage. Edward Brennan was a hero. His story needs to be told." But the story took an unexpected turn when Dr. Chen's research uncovered something else in the naval archives. Commander Harrison hadn't acted alone. There had been a network of sympathizers and profiteers, people who had sold out their country for German gold. Some of their descendants were still prominent families in New England, their fortunes built on foundations of wartime betrayal. Thomas received his first anonymous threat 3 weeks after Dr. Chen's visit. It was subtle, just a note slipped under the door of the keeper's house. "Some stories are better left untold, for everyone's sake." Rex found the note first, growling at the paper as if it were a living threat. Thomas picked it up, read it, and felt the old familiar tension creep up his spine. Someone was worried about what they'd found, someone with something to lose if the truth came out. "We're not backing down," Thomas told Harold when he showed him the note. "Your grandfather died for this truth. We're going to see it through." Harold agreed, but Thomas could see the fear in the older man's eyes. This wasn't what either of them had signed up for. Thomas had come to the Lighthouse for peace, for healing. Instead, he'd stumbled into a decades-old conspiracy that apparently still had the power to threaten. Thomas increased his vigilance, the old military instincts kicking in. He varied his routines, installed motion sensors around the property, and started keeping a loaded shotgun by his bed. Rex, sensing the change in his handler's mood, became more alert, more protective. The dog, who had saved Thomas from IEDs in Afghanistan, was back on duty, watching for threats in the main fog. The second threat came in the form of a visit. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit arrived one afternoon, introducing himself as a lawyer representing concerned parties who had an interest in historical accuracy. He offered Thomas a significant sum of money to turn over all the materials and sign a non-disclosure agreement. "My clients believe that publicizing unverified allegations from wartime could damage the reputations of innocent families," the lawyer said smoothly. "Surely a veteran like yourself understands the importance of discretion." Thomas stood in the doorway of the keeper's house, Rex growling low beside him. "I understand the importance of truth," he replied, "and I understand what it means when someone tries to buy silence. Get off my property." The lawyer left, but not before making it clear that the offer wouldn't remain open indefinitely. "My clients have other ways of protecting their interests," he said, as he got into his black BMW. "Legal ways, of course, but lawyers can make life very difficult when they choose to." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stood in the lightroom, watching the beams sweep across the dark water, thinking about Edward Brennan standing in this same spot, knowing that powerful people wanted him silenced. The parallels were too obvious to ignore, but Thomas had something Brennan hadn't: the passage of time, the protection of historical distance, and most importantly, allies who believed in the truth. Dr. Chen was already preparing an article for the Naval History Journal. Harold had contacted a documentary filmmaker who was interested in the story. The truth was spreading too fast to be contained. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Harold's cousin, whom Harold had told about the discovery, remembered that their grandmother had left a safety deposit box that had never been opened. The family had assumed it contained nothing important, just old documents and perhaps some small valuables. But given what they'd learned about Edward Brennan, Harold decided it was worth checking. The safety deposit box contained Eleanor Brennan's own investigation into her husband's death. For 40 years after Edward died, she had quietly gathered information, interviewed other lighthouse keepers, collected rumors and whispers about what had really happened that December night in 1944. She had been more careful than her husband, more subtle in her investigation. And she had found something Edward hadn't, the name of the person who had pushed him from the lighthouse. It was there in her neat handwriting, in a letter she'd never sent. Patrick Morrison, Harrison's aide, confessed on his deathbed to Father McKenna that he had killed Edward on Harrison's orders. McKenna told me in confidence, but would never make it public. "The seal of confession," he said, "but I know the truth now. My Edward was murdered." Patrick Morrison's family was one of the prominent New England families Dr. Chen had identified as potentially connected to the wartime profiteering network. Suddenly, the threats made more sense. It wasn't just about historical reputation, it was about murder, even if the statute of limitations had long passed. Thomas and Harold took this new information to Dr. Chen, who in turn contacted the FBI's cold case unit. While no one could be prosecuted, the FBI was interested in documenting the case for their historical files. The investigation that followed was quiet but thorough. Agents interviewing elderly relatives, examining financial records that had been thought lost, piecing together a story of corruption that had infected the highest levels of regional military command during the war. Meanwhile, life at the lighthouse continued. Thomas still walked Rex along the rocky shore each morning, still maintained the light, still stood watch over the Atlantic. But now he felt a kinship with Edward Brennan that went beyond their shared military service. They were both men who had stumbled onto truths that others wanted hidden, both veterans who understood that some battles continued long after the war was officially over. Rex seemed to understand too. The dog spent less time at the basement door now, as if his job there was done. He'd found what needed finding, had led Thomas to the truth that had been waiting in the darkness for someone to discover it. One evening, as October turned to November and the first winter storms began to build on the horizon, Harold brought someone to meet Thomas. She was a small woman in her 80s, with eyes the same grey as Harold's and a straight backbone that suggested old steel. "This is Margaret Morrison," Harold said, "Patrick Morrison's daughter." Thomas tensed, Rex immediately picking up on his handler's mood and moving closer, but Margaret held up her hand, a gesture of peace. "I've come to apologize," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I've suspected for years that my father was involved in something terrible during the war. He drank himself to death in 1962, haunted by something he would never discuss. When I heard about your discovery, I knew it was true." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather journal. "This was my father's. I found it after he died, but I've never shown it to anyone. I think you should have it." The journal contained Patrick Morrison's partial confession, written in the shaky hand of a man destroyed by guilt and alcohol. He didn't provide all the details, but he confirmed the essential truth. He had pushed Edward Brennan from the lighthouse on Harrison's orders, making it look like an accident. The murder had haunted him for the rest of his life. "Your family," Margaret said to Harold, "deserves to know the truth, and my family, we need to face what our fortune was built on. Blood money, that's what it was. Blood money from German U-boats and the murder of a good man." It was a moment of grace that Thomas hadn't expected. In his experience, people rarely admitted to family sins, rarely chose truth over comfortable lies. But Margaret Morrison had courage, the kind that it took to face ugly truths and try to make amends, even when amends were impossible. Dr. Chen's article was published in the spring, followed by a feature in the New York Times that brought national attention to the story. The documentary filmmaker Harold had contacted produced a powerful film that premiered at the Maine Maritime Museum. Edward Brennan was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his service and sacrifice. The lighthouse was designated a historical site, with a plaque commemorating Brennan's courage in exposing treason at the cost of his own life. But for Thomas, the most meaningful moment came on a quiet afternoon in June, when Harold brought his grandchildren to the lighthouse. They were young, 8 and 10, wide-eyed at the story of their great-great-grandfather, the hero. Thomas watched them explore the lighthouse, Rex following them protectively, and thought about how truth could skip generations, waiting for the right moment to surface. "He would have been proud," Harold said, standing beside Thomas as they watched the children play on the rocks where Edward Brennan had once stood watch. Knowing that the truth finally came out. Thomas nodded, his hand automatically finding Rex's head. The dog leaned against his leg, a steady presence that had seen him through war and now through this unexpected battle for truth. They had come to the lighthouse seeking peace and had found instead a purpose they hadn't expected, to be witnesses, to be the ones who brought light to shadows that had lingered too long. As summer progressed, the lighthouse became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Veterans came to pay their respects to Edward Brennan. Historians came to study the documents. Families of other sailors who had died during the U-boat attacks came seeking closure, wondering if their loved ones had been victims of the same betrayal. Thomas and Rex greeted them all, sharing the story, showing them the hidden spaces where truth had waited patiently for discovery. The lighthouse keeper's house became an informal museum, with copies of Brennan's journals and photographs displayed for visitors to see. Margaret Morrison donated a substantial sum to establish a memorial fund in Edward Brennan's name, providing scholarships for the descendants of World War II veterans. One visitor stood out from the others. She arrived on a foggy morning in July, an elderly woman with a cane and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She introduced herself as Anne Harrison, Commander Harrison's granddaughter. "I've wondered all my life," she said, standing in the lightroom looking out at the sea. "My mother never spoke of him, you know. Just said he died in the war and changed the subject. Now I know why." She had brought something with her, a box of her grandfather's personal effects that her mother had hidden away. Among them were coded telegrams that matched the ones in Brennan's evidence, further proof of Harrison's treachery. "I'm not here to make excuses," Anne said, "or to ask for forgiveness that isn't mine to receive. I needed to see where it happened, where Edward Brennan stood up to my grandfather and paid the price." Thomas found himself moved by her courage, the same kind of courage Margaret Morrison had shown. "It took strength to face the sins of your ancestors, to choose truth over the comfort of ignorance. Your grandfather made his choices," Thomas told her. "You're not responsible for them. But by coming here, by acknowledging the truth, you're helping to heal old wounds." Anne nodded, tears on her weathered cheeks. "I've lived my whole life trying to be a good person, trying to make up for something I didn't even know about. Maybe now I can stop running from a ghost I never knew was chasing me." As fall approached again, marking a year since Thomas and Rex had arrived at the lighthouse, Thomas realized how much had changed. He had come seeking solitude and had found community. He had come running from his own ghosts and had helped lay others to rest. The nightmares from Afghanistan still came sometimes, but less frequently. And when they did, Rex was there, a warm presence in the darkness, a reminder that he had survived, that he had purpose still. The lighthouse itself seemed different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of its secret had been holding it down all these years. The beam still swept across the water each night, but now it felt like more than just a warning to ships. It felt like a beacon of truth, a reminder that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of finding their light. Harold had become a close friend, stopping by several times a week to share coffee and stories. He was working on a book about his grandfather, using the journals and documents to piece together not just the story of the betrayal, but the story of the man who had stood against it. "You know," Harold said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, "I think my grandfather would have liked you. Both veterans, both men who understood that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones nobody sees." Thomas thought about that as he climbed to the light room that night, Rex padding up the stairs beside him. Edward Brennan had fought his battle alone, had died without knowing if his truth would ever surface. Thomas had been luckier. He'd had Rex, had Harold, had Dr. Chen, and all the others who had helped bring the story to light. Standing in the light room, watching the beams sweep across the dark Atlantic, Thomas pulled out Edward Brennan's final journal entry and read it again. "The light still shines, but shadows move within it. The truth is in the lens." The truth had been in more than just the lens. It had been in the persistence of a dog trained to find hidden things. It had been in the courage of descendants willing to face uncomfortable truths. It had been in the simple act of bearing witness, of refusing to let a hero's sacrifice be forgotten. Rex whined softly, and Thomas realized he'd been standing there for a long time, lost in thought. "Come on, boy," he said. "Let's go home." They descended the stairs together, man and dog, keepers of a lighthouse that had finally given up its secrets. Outside, the fog was rolling in, but the light continued its steady rotation, unbothered by the weather, constant as truth itself. In the keeper's house, Thomas made dinner for himself and Rex, the simple routine of it comforting. He thought about the tourists who would come tomorrow, eager to hear the story of Edward Brennan and the secret of Pemaquid Light. He would tell them, as he had told so many others, because that was his job now, not just to maintain the lighthouse, but to maintain the memory of the man who had died defending truth. Later, as he sat by the fire with a book, Rex curled at his feet. Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He had come to the lighthouse broken, seeking healing in isolation. Instead, he had found healing in connection, in purpose, in the unexpected discovery that had linked him to a man who had died decades before he was born. The winter storms came early that year, fierce nor'easters that battered the coast and sent waves crashing over the rocks below the lighthouse. Thomas and Rex weathered them together, safe in the keeper's house, the lighthouse standing firm as it had for over a century. During the storms, when the power flickered and the wind howled, Thomas would think of all the keepers who had stood watch here, all the storms they had endured. One particularly fierce night, when the wind was so strong it seemed the house might lift off its foundation, Rex suddenly alert, moving to the window that faced the sea. Thomas joined him, peering out into the darkness. There, barely visible through the storm, was a boat in distress, its lights flickering desperately. Thomas immediately called the Coast Guard, providing coordinates and conditions. Then he did something that lighthouse keepers had done for generations. He manually activated the fog signal, sending out a rhythmic blast that would help the boat orient itself in the chaos of the storm. The rescue took hours, the Coast Guard cutter fighting massive waves to reach the distressed vessel, but they made it, guided in part by the lighthouse's beam and the fog signal that Thomas kept sounding through the night. When dawn broke, grey and exhausted, the boat and its three-person crew were safe in harbour. The Coast Guard captain called Thomas later that day. "That fog signal made the difference," she said. "Gave us a reference point when the GPS was acting up. You saved lives last night." Thomas deflected the praise, but privately he felt something shift inside him. He had saved lives before, in Afghanistan, but this was different. This was the purpose of the lighthouse made manifest, to be a beacon in the darkness, to guide the lost home safely. As spring came again, bringing tourists and historians eager to learn about Edward Brennan, Thomas had added his own chapter to the lighthouse's story. The local newspaper ran a feature about the rescue, dubbing Thomas and Rex the guardian angels of Pemaquid Light. Thomas disliked the attention, but Harold convinced him it was important. People need to know this lighthouse is still vital, Harold said, not just as a historical site, but as a living, working piece of maritime safety. You've proven that. Margaret Morrison and Anne Harrison had become friends, bonding over their shared need to atone for their family's past. They organized a memorial service for Edward Brennan on the anniversary of his death, December 15th. Veterans, historians, and locals gathered at the lighthouse on a cold, clear morning, the Atlantic calm for once, as if paying its own respects. Thomas spoke at the service briefly and simply. Edward Brennan died defending truth. He stood watch at this lighthouse, protecting not just ships from rocks, but his country from betrayal. We honor him not just by remembering his sacrifice, but by continuing his work, to be beacons of truth in a world that sometimes prefers comfortable lies. After the service, as people milled about, sharing stories and hot coffee, a young naval officer approached Thomas. She was perhaps 25, with the same earnest intensity Thomas remembered from his own early service days. "Sir," she said, saluting smartly, "Ensign Sarah Brennan. Edward was my great-great-uncle. I wanted to thank you for what you've done, for bringing the truth to light." Thomas returned the salute, feeling the weight of connection across generations. "He was a hero, Ensign. Never forget that." "I won't, sir. In fact, I requested assignment to Naval Intelligence because of him. Someone needs to stand watch against the shadows, right?" Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. "That's right, Ensign. Someone always needs to stand watch." As the gathering dispersed and quiet returned to the lighthouse, Thomas and Rex walked down to the rocks, where Edward Brennan had fallen. Thomas had avoided this spot for months, but now felt ready to face it. The rocks were dark and jagged, worn smooth in places by centuries of waves. It would have been easy to make a murder look like an accident here, especially on a dark December night. Rex sniffed around the rocks, then sat, looking up at Thomas with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen so much, understood so much. Thomas knelt beside his dog, his hand finding the familiar comfort of Rex's fur. "We did good, boy," he said quietly. "We did good." That evening, as Thomas prepared dinner, he found himself humming, something he hadn't done since before Afghanistan. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of cooking and the comfortable presence of Rex lounging by the stove. Outside, the light was beginning its nightly vigil, the beam sweeping steadily across the darkening sky. The phone rang, and Thomas was surprised to hear Dr. Chen's voice. "Thomas, I have news. The Navy has decided to create a permanent memorial to Edward Brennan at the Naval War College. They want you to speak at the dedication." Thomas's first instinct was to decline. He didn't do public speaking, didn't like attention, but then he thought about Edward Brennan, standing alone against powerful forces, and realized he owed him this much. "When?" he asked. "Next month, May 15th, the anniversary of when Brennan took up his post at the lighthouse. It seemed fitting, coming full circle. I'll be there." After he hung up, Thomas stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the Atlantic. The sea was calm tonight, painted silver by moonlight. Somewhere out there, ships were passing safely by the rocks, guided by the lighthouse beam. It was a simple thing, light in darkness, but it mattered. Edward Brennan had understood that. Now Thomas did too. The weeks passed quickly. Thomas and Rex continued their routines, but now with a sense of purpose that had been missing before. The lighthouse was no longer just a refuge. It was a responsibility, a trust passed down through generations of keepers. The day before the Naval War College dedication, Thomas and Rex stood in the light room one last time before their trip. The lens turned steadily, its prisms catching the afternoon sun and throwing rainbows across the walls. Thomas thought about Edward Brennan's words, "The truth is in the lens." He had been right, but not in the way Thomas had first understood. The truth wasn't just in the physical lens or the documents hidden beneath it. The truth was in the purpose of the lens itself, to cast light into darkness, to provide guidance when the way was unclear, to stand constant against the storm. At the dedication ceremony, standing before an audience of naval officers, historians, and Brennan's descendants, Thomas spoke from the heart. He talked about the courage it took to stand alone against corruption, about the importance of truth, even when it comes decades late, about the lighthouse as a metaphor for the values Edward Brennan had died defending. Edward Brennan was a lighthouse keeper in more ways than one, Thomas concluded. He kept the light burning not just for ships at sea, but for truth itself. His beacon still shines in the stories we tell, in the history we preserve, in the courage we find to face difficult truths. May we all be keepers of that light. The applause was long and heartfelt. Afterward, Ensign Sarah Brennan approached him again, this time with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for giving us back our history." Returning to Pemaquid, Thomas felt a sense of completion. The story that had begun with Rex pawing at a basement door had come full circle. Edward Brennan's truth had been told, his sacrifice honored, his murder acknowledged, even if it could never be prosecuted. But life at the lighthouse continued. There were still storms to weather, tourists to guide, the endless maintenance that kept the light shining. Thomas and Rex settled back into their routines, but now those routines felt different, charged with meaning that went beyond simple duty. One morning in late summer, Harold arrived with unexpected news. "The Lighthouse Board wants to create a museum," he said. "A proper one, in the old oil house. They want to display Edward's journals, the evidence you found, tell the whole story. They want you to be the curator." Thomas's first reaction was to refuse. He was a lighthouse keeper, not a museum curator. But then he thought about all the people who had come to hear the story, all the questions they'd asked, all the connections they'd made to their own family histories. "Can Rex and I still live in the keeper's house?" he asked. "Of course. You're the keeper. That doesn't change." Thomas agreed, and over the following months, he worked with historians and museum professionals to create a space that honored not just Edward Brennan, but all the lighthouse keepers who had stood watch at Pemaquid. The museum told the story of the lighthouse itself, its role in maritime safety, its place in the secret history of World War II, and its continuing importance as a beacon of truth. The museum's opening drew hundreds of people. Margaret Morrison and Anne Harrison cut the ribbon together, a symbol of reconciliation and the power of confronting difficult truths. Dr. Chen gave a lecture on the role of coastal defenses during World War II. Local veterans shared their own stories of service and sacrifice, but the most moving moment came when an elderly man approached Thomas after the ceremony. He was 93, one of the last surviving merchant mariners from World War II. "I sailed past this light in 1943, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Lost friends on a ship that was torpedoed just south of here. Always wondered if someone had sold us out. Now I know. Thank you for finding the truth. Thank you for proving we weren't just unlucky. We were betrayed." As fall turned to winter again, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had come to the lighthouse as a broken soldier, seeking solitude. He had found instead a purpose he hadn't expected, to be a keeper, not just of the light, but of memory, truth, and justice delayed, but not denied. Rex was getting older now, moving a bit slower on their morning walks, spending more time sleeping by the fire. But he still had his moments of alertness, still watched over Thomas with the dedication that had saved lives in Afghanistan and uncovered truth in Maine. Thomas knew their time together was limited, knew that one day he would have to say goodbye to his faithful companion. But not yet, not today. Standing in the light room on a clear winter night, the stars brilliant overhead and the beams sweeping steadily across the calm sea, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. He had found what he'd come looking for, though not in the way he'd expected. The nightmares from Afghanistan still came occasionally, but they no longer defined him. He had a new mission now, a purpose that honored both his service and Edward Brennan's sacrifice. "We're home, boy," he said to Rex, who had climbed the stairs to join him despite his aging joints. "We're finally home." The lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, casting light into darkness, warning of dangers, guiding travelers safely past the rocks. It was a simple thing, but profound in its constancy. Like truth itself, Thomas thought. Sometimes buried, sometimes hidden, but always there, waiting for someone with the courage to bring it to light. As they descended the stairs together, Thomas thought about all the nights ahead, all the storms they would weather, all the stories they would tell to those who came seeking the truth about Pemaquid Light. He thought about Edward Brennan, whose courage had transcended death itself, whose truth had waited patiently for someone to discover it. The keeper's house was warm and welcoming, the fire crackling in the hearth. Thomas made tea and settled into his chair with one of Brennan's journals. Rex curled at his feet. Outside, the winter wind picked up, but inside they were safe, keeper and dog, guardians of a lighthouse that had finally given up its secrets, but would never give up its purpose. In the morning there would be tourists to guide, weather readings to record, the endless small tasks that kept the lighthouse functioning. But tonight, there was just peace, the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, and the quiet companionship of a faithful friend. The light continued to shine, as it had for over a century, as it would for centuries to come. And somewhere, Thomas was certain, Edward Brennan was at peace, knowing that his sacrifice had not been in vain, that his truth had finally found its light. This incredible true story reminds us that sometimes the most important discoveries come when we least expect them, and that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep it's buried. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others who need to hear about the courage of those who stand for truth. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell to join us for more amazing stories of hidden history and unexpected heroes. Remember, sometimes the greatest mysteries are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the courage to uncover them. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Pemaquid Light, where a veteran and his faithful dog revealed a truth that had been locked away for decades, proving that it's never too late for justice to shine through.